Hello, I'm Tom O'Dea.
And I'm Dennis McNulty.
We are both artists working at Connect. Connect is the Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre for Future Networks and Communications. Today, we're going to talk about the Connect AI and Machine Learning Ethics Toolkit.
The toolkit was developed by Designing for the Unknown, a research platform at Connect that brings artists and engineers into conversation. We've formatted the toolkit as a series of questions. We think the best way to use it is to sit down with a colleague and work through the questions together. We've found that things come up in the course of a conversation that you might not think of if you're just reading through the toolkit on your own.
In the first section, Context, the question is, who are the people that influence the choices made in my research? So with this question, we're trying to create an awareness of the wide variety of people who influence the decisions made in a research project. For academic researchers, the obvious ones would be supervisors, PIs, funding bodies, or industry partners. Or in an industry context, this could be customers or clients. But this question is deliberately quite open, so there's an implication here that you might try to cast the net a little bit wider.
The next section is Inputs. And there are two questions in this section. The first is, what sort of inputs are needed to produce my research? And the second question is, how are each of these inputs selected? With these questions, we're hoping to bring your attention to the resources researchers might draw on to produce their work. The second question explicitly asks you to consider how each input is selected.
In AI and machine learning research, inputs include things like data, processes, and practices. Other examples of inputs are archives, theoretical frameworks, lab methodologies, and other researchers' papers. What we're trying to get at is the idea that some of these inputs might be chosen consciously, but some might be chosen for pragmatic reasons, or because of the prevailing research culture. We feel that the act of listing them and thinking about why they are part of the picture is useful.
There are three questions in Section 3 gathered under the heading Data. The first is, if my data refers to humans, do they know and understand how it's being used? This question is specifically related to the context of AI and machine learning. As we know from the GDPR, consent is a major ethical issue with data. It's important to be clear about whether somebody has explicitly agreed to allow you to use their data or not. This question actually pushes that a little further by asking whether they understand what that data is being used for. And so we're asking researchers to think beyond consent.
The other two questions in this section are prompts to think a little bit more about the specificities of data. Could the data I'm using be considered sensitive or private? And, if I remove the sensitive data, would my solution be as good?
The next section deals with what we've called processes. There are also three questions in this section. The first is, how do the processes used in my research function? By processes, we mean things like algorithms, practices, toolboxes, and so on. This question relates to the notion of explainability, which is something that's the subject of much debate at the moment. Namely, is it or should it be possible for a researcher to explain how a technical system is generating its output?
The next question follows on from this. Which features of my dataset is my chosen algorithm using to make its decisions? We were thinking here of well-documented cases where algorithms have been proven to have been making simplistic decisions based on race or gender because of the datasets on which they were trained. Another way to think about this might be to ask yourself, is there any part of the dataset that I think should not be used to make these decisions? So, while it might be difficult for a researcher using a deep learning approach, for example, to answer these questions, we still feel it's important that they are asked.
The final process-related question is, what influences my choice of these processes? We're hoping that this might prompt researchers to think about how they've ended up using certain processes in their work. Maybe these are just the tools that are commonly used in this field of research. Or maybe these are the tools they're familiar with. Or is it just that there is expertise about these tools available to them? Or could there be other reasons?
There are also 3 questions in the next section, which is to do with outputs. The first one asks, how will people interact with the outputs of my research? We accept that it might be difficult to answer this with any degree of certainty, but we hope that it might prompt a researcher to visualise the ways in which their work might operate in the research community and in the wider world. The follow-up questions attempt to offer a framework for exploring this further.
The next question is, how will the outputs of my research exist as part of wider systems? So by using the term wider systems, we're alluding to the ways in which engineering research gets absorbed into different systems, from products to the sorts of research practices we've been discussing here. So the question is, how will this work form part of the bigger picture?
And the final question in this section asks, who are the people whose choices are influenced by the outputs of my research? The questions so far have considered the ways in which our own choices might be influenced by our environment and by other researchers. This question prompts us to consider those relationships, but from the opposite perspective.
The final section repeats the first question again. Who are the people that influence the choices made in my research? We're aware that presenting this toolkit as a list might produce the sense that once the questions have been answered, the work is done. But the ethical questions we've been discussing are related to each other in complex ways, so the answers in one section can influence those in another. So one reason we chose to repeat this question is to draw attention to the fact that ethical reflection is an ongoing process.
The fact is, we all make ethical decisions all the time. Often they're not explicit, but making these decisions is very much a part of living with others on this planet. Then there are other ethical decisions you may have to make in your role as an engineer, and still others you might make specifically because you're an engineer working with AI or machine learning. And so this toolkit is designed to create a space for thinking about these ethical questions within your research practice.
We hope you find this toolkit useful. This is version 1.0. It's the first step in an ongoing development process. And so we're interested to hear any feedback you might have. We can be contacted at the address shown on screen. Thanks for watching.